Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The left-wing government in Venezuela is fighting back against its sea of troubles and appears to be winning.
US-sponsored color revolutions previously used to go only one way: the defeat of the target and the replacement by stooges.
Not so Venezuela, where the successor to President Hugo Chavez has struggled with economic and financial problems, the low price of oil, and of course, US-financed subversion and even deadly violence.
All rather familiar in Latin America for more than half a century, but President Nicolas Maduro, clinging tightly to the constitution, has begun to win elections.
Recently returned from his role as an observer of the latest set of polls is Calvin Tucker of the Morning Star, who joins us now. Calvin, where did it all go right? How come this has apparently been turned around?
Well, I would actually say that Venezuela is currently in quite a difficult economic and social situation. There is hyperinflation. We have shortages of some basic foodstuffs and medicine. But there's really two competing narratives for who's responsible for these problems. You have the opposition in the United States point of view, which is this is all the fault of the socialist government, and in particular President Maduro. And then you have the government's point of view, which is that the country has been subject to economic warfare and US sanctions, which have created and which are fueling these problems. But judging by the results of the elections that I observed a week ago, the Venezuelan public are siding with the government on this issue, I think.
Tell us about those elections and what you saw with your own eyes.
Well, I was there as part of what's called the International Electoral Accompaniment Mission. That is 50 international people from all walks of life, different political parties. We had academics, mayors of towns and cities across Europe and Latin America, journalists and so forth. We also had a group of experts from Latin America who were part of what's called the CELA mission. And these are really quite centrist or even centre-right establishment figures, former government ministers in Latin American countries, former heads of electoral commission, and so forth. So it was a very mixed group of people. And we were allowed to talk freely to opposition political party politicians, to ordinary voters, to witnesses during each stage of the electoral process. And we got to audit the electoral count itself.
And you were, pleased or at least satisfied with the arrangements for the election and, of course, the counting, which is sometimes more important than the voting itself.
Well, quite. Venezuela, actually, contrary to the popular media mythology, actually has the most audited and safest electoral system in the world.
I was about to say, quite a dictatorship, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Quite.
Jimmy Carter described it as pristine, the presidential election that we observed.
In 2012.
Chavez' last one.
Indeed. And in the report of the observer team, and I should say this was agreed unanimously by every single observer, we describe it as the best electoral system in the world. And that's because it combines a computer touchscreen voting system with an auditing process where the paper ballots which are produced when a voter touches the electoral, touches a computer screen, are then put into a box, and at the end of the process, the boxes tipped out, and in front of the witnesses from all the political parties, the paper receipts, the ballots, if you like, are counted and compared to the computerised results. Those results are then put on the website of the CNE, that's the name of the Venezuelan Electoral Commission, so everybody can compare the tally with the computerised results. So if there's any fraud, the opposition political parties themselves have actually signed the tally sheet.
The narrative is that Venezuela is and has been a dictatorship, in which case it is the most elected dictatorship on the earth. No country on the earth has had as many elections, referenda, and, as you've just explained, in the most pristine, corruption-proof manner. How do you account for that?
Well, I think I think there's a Western narrative which has unfortunately gained traction, which stems from Venezuelans' challenge to the neoliberal elites, and I would say that the divisions within Venezuelan society are exactly the same as the divisions within British society. I mean, if you travel to Caracas, as I know you've done, George, what's immediately apparent to you is that you have the upper and middle classes living in the central areas of Caracas, and then up on the mountains you have what are called the barrios. We could call them favelas in Brazil, or shanty towns. People might be more familiar with that name. And that's where working class and poor people live. So you literally have a situation where the poor are looking down on the rich who are looking up at the poor. So that's the physical and geographical reality of the polarization in Venezuelan society. So it wasn't Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro that cooked up this conflict. It's been brewing for decades and decades and decades. And all that's happened is that there's been a transfer of political power, if you like, in physical terms, from the central areas of Caracas up into the barrios that surround it.
Now, that there is economic subversion of Venezuela by the United States could only be denied by someone who's like 13 or who knows nothing of the US's role in destabilizing countries from Guatemala in the 50s through Nicaragua in the 70s and 80s, and Chile, of course, and you mentioned it, in the early 70s, where the president himself was murdered in a coup organized by the United States. So that subversion can't be gainsaid. That the opposition are fiercely opposed to the process in Venezuela is genuine. Whatever the US involvement in it is genuinely felt by the rich, by their comprador in the country. All that is a given. But there have been mistakes made, particularly in the economic field, by the Chavez-Maduro period. I think they would accept that themselves. If they wouldn't, it's foolish. Did you yourself see anything wrong or that could be done better in your view?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, contradictions within Venezuelan society and economy abound wherever you look. But I think the critical point is that the government has restored security to the streets and security to the neighbourhoods following the period of opposition violence that took place over the summer and the opposition attacks on the electoral process. And that's really led to quite a surprising sea change, I think, in public attitudes towards the future.
Now, you mentioned security, and the kind of threats to security that we saw in these demonstrations and street occupations and so on was obviously enough. But one of the contradictions that we noticed, for example, is the murder rate in Venezuela, the depredation of organized criminal gangs and so on. It's difficult to square that with a revolution going on. I mean, in a real revolution, there wouldn't be any criminals around to murder you. They'd all be behind bars or 6 foot under the earth. Have they got to grips with the crime issue? Because for us, that was a major factor in seeping away at the revolution's popularity.
Yeah, you can't argue with it.
No, I mean, that's it. It's clearly a big problem, and it's something that would affect almost all Venezuelan citizens. Having said that, most of the gang violence or killings would be inter-gang related. So you can't really extrapolate that level of crime down to the ordinary person on the street, although it has to be said, to be fair, it is many times more dangerous than it is walking around a city like London or Paris or New York in the evening. In terms of what they do about it, it's difficult. I mean, the sort of decisive security operation that people could argue perhaps is necessary to deal with this level of gang violence would fall foul of the rule of law and of due process. And one thing the Venezuelan government is continually stresses is that this is a legitimate constitutional democratic process, and they're going to stick with it, even though that sometimes leads to difficult or negative consequences. So it's a dilemma for the government, but certainly there's a lot of people in the street who were calling for more decisive action.
Well, if it's done to please the Liberal Guardian and the rest, it doesn't work, because the unremitting hostility of the liberal media and liberal political class towards Venezuela is, I'm afraid, undimmed. But you, in that report, I hope, have redressed the imbalance. Calvin Tucker, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Coming up, it's the bleak midwinter in Britain in the 21st century. So, of course, there must be a crisis in the NHS. Stay tuned for more.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Health Trust chairman resigning. The least popular health secretary presiding. Staff abandoning ship at a rate of knots. Waiting lists lengthening. Potential privatization looming. What's not to fear? Dr. Bob Gill is a family doctor and the producer of the crowd-funded film The Great NHS Heist. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. Dr. Bob, welcome back on the Sputnik. Everywhere you look, the headlines are crisis. The latest one I saw said there was 100,000 staff missing, couldn't be recruited. I know from my own life, I asked for a specialist skin appointment 4 months ago and will not get it for another month. That makes 5 months to wait to see a specialist. Everywhere we hear of mounting pressure on the system. What's it all about?
It shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone, George. Since 2010, we've had a funding squeeze on the NHS. The historic rate of increase for NHS funding was about 4%. We've had less than 1% for coming up to 8 years. And now that pressure is starting to tell. The government do want these bad headlines because they have to persuade the public that the NHS is broken.
That it's a busted flush.
Yeah, they have to break the morale of the staff. They have to destroy the trust with the staff and the public. And there'll come a point where the general consensus will be something needs to be done. And that's when they'll be presented with the fake solution of a conversion to an insurance system. So this is all going according to plan. And when I hear people misframing this as some sort of incompetence, it's missing the point. This is deliberate, this is defunding, and this is setting the NHS up to fail.
Well, I've heard you argue that before, and we'll come back to it. But none of that is to say that there are not severe problems in the NHS, is it? You're not arguing that it's all, a government conspiracy.
There are very many problems. I'm experiencing problems myself. My own practice has lost 20% of its funding in the last 3 or 4 years. I know I'm a trainer of other doctors. Doctors who finish their training in general practice don't want to do general practice. The morale is rock bottom, and I know the care of my patients is suffering. So there are genuine problems out there. The difficulty for people like myself who are trying to say we need to protect this model is that it's falling around about our ears. But people need to understand how we got to this situation. There's deliberate vandalism, and we saw this with British Rail. You defund it for years, you make it a laughing stock, you show that it's not working, and then you present fake solutions to the public.
It's a very interesting thesis, and your crowd-funded film, The Great NHS Heist, makes that case. Let's assume, as a hypothetical, that that's what is going on. When do they present us with the big reveal? When do they pull the rabbit of privatization out of the hat?
I don't think there'll be a big bang. There won't be a sudden flip. We're already seeing companies like Vitality doing blanket advertising. If you watch any Premiership football match, you'll see Vitality Insurance.
Was that the Bournemouth sponsor, the Vitality Stadium?
They're all over the Premiership, and I think that's Vitality Stadium there. I think Liverpool Football Club have entered into a detail. I need to check that. But if you open any of these free magazines, the Metro...
And Virgin Care also, wasn't it? It was
Virgin
Care.
Virgin have a tie-in with Vitality. I'm not sure whether they're in a formal business relationship, but there's a tie-in there. And they are building a insurance base. They are building this base of patients who are seeing the NHS collapse. You're going to have a gradual middle-class drift away from the NHS. Services are being cut, so it's harder to access treatment. As yourself, you've experienced a 4-month wait. So people will make a decision, do I go and pay out of pocket, or do I get insurance?
Well, even I, as a zealot, it has crossed my mind. I wouldn't do it and haven't done it, but it did cross my mind. 5 months to see a skin doctor. I could just open my wallet and see one this afternoon.
Well, George, if it's having that effect on you, who believes it to the core in the NHS, it will have that effect on a lot of people. And we know there's been a significant increase in the number of people paying one-off for an operation, for example, a knee replacement or a hip replacement, rather than wait in agony for a year, 18 months. So this is all part of the propaganda, very complex propaganda that's going on at the moment.
So we had a properly publicly funded, free at the point of use, comprehensive NHS, which then, under Mrs. Thatcher, began part privatisation. The Blair era tried something different, so-called PFI, public-private partnerships, which even the Blairites now accept was a disaster. We're back to, in a way, the status quo ante, or at least the Mrs. Thatcher era status quo ante. It's your idea that Hunt and Theresa May and so on are actually the real revolutionaries. They're going to solve this matter once and for all, and in the American way.
Well, I would present it slightly differently. This has been a succession of legislation over the last 30 years with one destination. They haven't been separate. Tony Blair just did the next phase of the privatisation, which was to grab the land and the assets. And PFI was a mechanism for transferring our assets into the private sector. So you close down a publicly owned hospital and you build an expensive private finance initiative, debt-laden hospital. And that transfers the ownership. So you had this gradual transfer of ownership of the assets. In 2012, we had the setting up of clinical commissioning groups, which grabs the budgets, and those budgets in due course will be transferred to insurance companies like United Health of America.
Bob, Dr. Bob, George mentioned in the beginning the loss or the missing of 100,000 jobs, which is an astonishing amount. Now, the media coverage mentions Brexit as one of the reasons. Well, during my pregnancy, most of the practitioners that helped me were, no offense to them, but foreigners, and recent foreigners from the Commonwealth. I'm just wondering, to what extent is Brexit indeed a game changer?
Well, I've spoken to a European nurse who's campaigning for Europeans' rights in this country. It's definitely been a factor, particularly in London, where we know up to a third of the nurses are overseas trained, a quarter of the doctors are overseas trained.
But when you say overseas, do you mean over the channel or farther overseas?
Farther overseas, but there's certainly...
Because they're not affected by Brexit.
They're not affected, but there's certainly a significant number of Portuguese, Spanish and other European nurses and doctors who've come to work here. And when Theresa May couldn't give a clear answer over their status, they started to drift away. How can you...
Any idea to where?
Yeah.
Drifting back home. Drifting back home or looking elsewhere.
It's not a bad thing, of course, to strengthen the health service in their own countries.
Not bad at all, but they have been driven out of their countries by even more dire economic situations in their home country. And we couldn't offer them the dignity of security for their families and for their children in this country, and they're drifting away.
So you think Brexit is a definite factor?
It is a factor, but it all plays into the plan.
Because but why 100,000?
Yeah.
I mean, 100,000 is what, a tenth of the labour force? More than a tenth.
Yeah, the numbers break down approximately 10,000 doctors, 40,000 nurses, and the rest made up of other health professionals and ancillary staff. But the other key thing, George,
Isn't low wages the principal reason?
Low wages is a factor. So doctors and nurses have suffered a 15% net reduction in their salaries since 2010, since the crash. And that is a factor. People are finding it hard to make ends meet. Nurses are going to food banks. That's a factor. But if you come to work and you cannot deliver a satisfactory job and your patients aren't getting the best treatment and you're going home demoralized, that is another big factor. So doctors who aren't the worst paid in society are giving up because their morale is rock bottom, they're treated like dirt, and junior doctors more recently have had a dangerous contract imposed upon them. But the point I want to make is the de-skilling, because the new NHS, the privatised NHS, does not want expensive, highly qualified staff. They want the cheapest, most precarious staff possible, and we've seen this down-skilling or task shifting as part of the privatisation.
And when you say those are demoralized, they leave. Where do they go?
Some retire early, some just give up medicine because...
Or they go to the private industry.
They may drift off into the private sector. The grass is not greener. They'll soon realise that private employers are only interested in one thing, the bottom line, the money. And, I've spoken to people who work in the private sector. Although the NHS is struggling now, there are statutory duties to perform to a certain level. Those don't exist in the private sector.
Now, with respect to them, I don't really hear this clarity of analysis that you persistently make. I don't really hear it from the opposition front bench in Parliament. Maybe I'm missing it, but as you explain it to me, it's very clear. I don't feel that way often about the Labour front bench.
George, this troubles me greatly. I hear the odd good thing from Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, but we know there's a significant rump of neoliberal Blairite elements within the party, and they will use any opportunity to undermine Jeremy and John McDonnell. So there is a problem in the Labour Party. I'm still waiting to hear from John Ashworth something clear, because this would be a vote winner to warn the public our system is being turned over to American multinationals and is turning into an insurance-based system. You would have thought they'd be shouting this from the rooftops. Why aren't they shouting this? And unfortunately, it's left to activists and others like myself and Professor Alison Pollock, who's recently launched a judicial review into the next phase of the reorganisation, which is the creation of accountable care organisations, which are based on the American model.
May God preserve you, Dr. Bob Gill. And just in a nutshell, what's happened with the film?
The film, we're into the editing phase. We're still looking for funding. So if people go to our GoFundMe page, that would be grateful if they can donate. We're in the editing phase and we hope to get it out early next year. And we'd love both of you to come and watch the premiere.
Fantastic.
Just say the GoFundMe address.
It's gofundme.com, The Great NHS Heist.
I hope that we're on the red carpet for the premiere.
Definitely.
Dr. Bob Gill, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's happening, Gayatri?
Well, do you think Venezuela will have better press coverage in 2018?
Definitely not.
Kila Lakeri says Venezuelans' weakness, from what I have seen, is being too reliant on oil sold to the US and the West. They even have a joint fuel company with the US called Citgo. How does that even work?
Well, America's the biggest customer of Venezuelan oil because of the geographical proximity.
Yes.
And it's not Venezuela's fault that God put America's oil underneath their territory, as Donald Rumsfeld once put it.
Well put, indeed. Elizabeth Bond says about the NHS, my mom came to the UK as part of a scheme originally pioneered by Enoch Powell to train doctors and nurses to work for the NHS. After 40+ years, she retired and said it was extremely tough work. Here's her take on why a friend of mine recently quit midwifery despite a first-class honours degree. And then the testimony goes into pretty good detail on how straining the job was, basically.
Oh, definitely. One of the greatest of all historical ironies that it was Enoch Powell who toured the Caribbean begging the workers there to come to Britain and work in our NHS, only then to turn on them and stab them in the back.
Well, that's all the tweets we've got time for today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today, or on Instagram and Twitter, RT_Sputnik. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous. Merry Christmas.